When my daughter told me to find somewhere else to die, I folded my favorite blue sweater into a neat rectangle and put it into a suitcase the way I had packed lunches for 3 children and a husband who could not be bothered to look up from his papers. The sentence landed like a slammed door, and in that exact silence, I decided that this was not the end of me. I walked out of my own kitchen like a woman who had learned how to leave more than once in her life, and like a woman who had been keeping a secret small enough to fit in a drawer and large enough to wreck everything. I remember the smell of lemon cleaner on the counter, the sun that had always hit the old oak table at noon, and the way my hands shook when I locked the front door for the last time. 3 days later, I sat across from Robert in his glassy office while he opened a manila envelope and read aloud words that should have been plain and final, but turned into a trap the moment someone else wrote them. He slid a photocopy of a document toward me and said, "You need to see this. The signature is not your hand." My throat tightened. The word trust floated in the air like smoke. For 50 years, I had believed that marriage and the small ledger books my husband kept were the anchors of our life. I had believed that the papers in his safe were honest because his hands trembled at the sight of ink. But the photocopy had dates that did not match his hospital stays, initials that did not match his neatness, and a clause that gave all to my daughter Lily if I was deemed unfit. It was elegant and clinical and cold. It was a betrayal dressed as law. My name is Evelyn Harper, and for most of my life, I was exactly what people expect when they hear the word mother. I made a home that smelt like bread and soap. I taught my children to read, to fold sheets so corners matched, to say thank you. I married once at 27 to a man whose laugh filled the den and who taught me to care for a garden the way one tends to a secret. After he died, I kept the house and its small dignity. I volunteered at the community center, baked for the church bake sale, and because I believed in keeping accounts, I watched pennies so that on nights when the heat was erratic, we still had blankets. I expected loyalty because I had given what I could: time, thrift, patient listening. I never imagined that those things could be used to write me out of my own life. When Lily was small, she learned to make lemon meringue the way her fingers learned to tie shoelaces. She used to sit on the while I stirred and would hum the television jingle she liked. She was bright and dramatic, the sort of child who could play 2 instruments and recite a poem for the school play, and she carried that need to be seen into the world. She married Jack on a rainless day under an arbor of fairy lights and a handful of guests who cheered too loudly as if applause could make them happy. Jack was charming in the way all polished con artists are charming. He had a smile that could redefine a room and a memory for names. He worked at a finance firm across town and spoke about investments with a certain assuredness. Over time, he became the one who carried boxes when we moved lamps and the one who knew where the wrench drawer lived. He also learned how to read ledgers and how to whisper to my daughter the kind of things that make a person willing to cross a line. Car rides turned into therapy sessions. At dinner, he would compliment my roast and then ask offhand questions about whether I had updated any estate paperwork. I told myself that curiosity was just that when he suggested that perhaps I would be happier in a smaller place, that such a change would free me for a life of travel. I heard the suggestion, and I heard the sweetness underneath it that made me imagine beaches I would never visit. But there were nights I woke to the sound of him pacing in the spare room, the faint odor of cologne and cigarette that he tried to hide. I pretended not to notice the way he lingered too long by the safe, and the way Lily stopped answering some of my texts. I did not want to know. I had been taught that not knowing preserves peace, and that telling can destroy people you love. The incident that finally stripped us bare happened on a Tuesday when the air smelled like rain. Lily and Jack arrived with a box of casseroles and a patience that looked practiced. He sat down at my table and put his hand over mine like a son, And then he said the words I had imagined and the ones I had not. "You are getting older," he said. "You could move into assisted living, or we could sort out your affairs so you do not worry anyone." Lily nodded in that carefully coached way that made me feel like a puppet made of bones. My mouth went dry. I told them there was no need and that I preferred to keep my independence. They exchanged a look, an almost imperceptible swift exchange that said they had plans and they could not be stopped. Then Lily said it, and I remember the moment like a photograph developing in the darkroom where the image reveals itself in obscene light. "Mom, we need to talk about the trust," she said. Her voice was small and steady, and it sounded like someone reading a list at the post office. I felt the room shrink. The next hour is recorded in my memory as if under a high-definition lens with sound. I will show you this because truth is medicine that sometimes burns. Do not be surprised by the length of this exchange. "Show me the papers," I said. Lily set a thin folder on the table, and it made a dry whisper when she opened it. Jack folded his hands and smiled like a man selling horizon views. "Tell us about the hospital," Lily said. I answered in fragments and in pieces until I realized she had stopped listening and was instead watching for a cue. "Please, Mom," Jack said, "let us help." I looked at him and then at my daughter and asked, "How much?" She told me a number that felt like a weight. "Why would you do this?" I said. "We need to protect your assets," Lily replied. "Do you not want to make sure they stay in the family?" she asked. I said no, but the word came out thin. "This is for your own good," Jack added. "I am trying to be kind," he said. "You do not understand the way the world is changing," Lily said. "We want to make sure you are taken care of." "How dare you take my house?" I said. "We are not taking it," she said. "We are managing it," he said. "Signing papers means nothing if you are unwell," she said. "She does not know what is best for herself," he said. "We will do everything," she said. "You cannot live alone," he said. "You need help," she said. "You are being difficult," he said. They said kindness as if it were their right. Those exchanges between them numbered more than 10, and they were surgical. They had practiced tone, cadence, and the way to compress affection and insistence into sentences that would sound reasonable on a recording. I remember the softness of the chair I sat in, the mottled pattern of the tablecloth, the taste of lemon in my mouth from the casserole, the slight itch at the base of my throat as if something there had started to fracture. I left the kitchen that day with a plastic bag of clothes and the humiliation of a woman who had been told by her own daughter that she was a burden. I slept in a motel that smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee, my suitcase on the chair, the television murmuring a late-night show I could not follow. At 3 a.m, I took out the envelope Robert had given me and reread the photocopy until the words blurred. The first week after I left was a blur of paperwork and phone calls. I called Robert again and again until his assistant let me speak with him. His voice on the line was steady, legal and oddly comforting. He asked me to bring the original will and the safe deposit box key. The bank let me into the box, and my hands trembled as I touched old receipts and my husband's cufflinks. A trust agreement sat there, glossy and new, bearing my signature, but in a rhythm that was not mine. When Robert said for the first time that the signature looked like a forgery, I felt hollow with the sensation of a bottom dropping away. He promised to investigate, but told me that the process would be slow. We needed to be strategic. That word strategic felt like a weapon and a balm. 1 week after that, Robert introduced me to Detective Garcia and Hannah Lee, a forensic accountant who smelled faintly of jasmine and who spoke the way a person explains a puzzle to a child. Detective Garcia sat with his hands folded, a man whose uniform had been replaced by a plain suit and whose eyes had a gravity I trusted. Hannah had a stack of printed bank records and an ability to find patterns in numbers like birds finding direction. We sat in Robert's office with the blinds half closed and the overhead light humming. He said, "We can freeze accounts if we have probable cause." Hannah said, "There are transfers that look structured to hide a larger movement of funds." Detective Garcia said, "If we can tie those movements to you or to anyone acting on your behalf under false pretenses, we have grounds for a fraud investigation." Robert warned me the fight would be messy and public. I felt a weird exhilaration. Sometimes the thought of facing them in a courtroom felt like standing in full sunlight after a long winter. At this point, I want to pause to ask you something that matters. If you are watching this and you have ever felt like a stranger in the house where you grew up or in the family that should have protected you, please share where you are watching from and if you have seen anything like this. Start your comment with "my relative" and a short phrase. Your words may seem small, but they offer comfort to someone who is shivering. We are a community that hears each other. If you have been through a betrayal like this, say, "My relative did this," and tell us the country or city. If you are not ready to speak, a like or a share helps others find this story. I will read some comments in a follow-up because there is power in shared experience. Now, let me take you back to Robert's office, the day Hannah handed me a photocopy of my own life in numbers and asked me to point out anything that did not belong. The legal turn in this fight began with procedure and a kind of arithmetic cruelty. Hannah began with bank statements and traced transfers from my account to a firm connected to Jack. She found small recurring withdrawals that started as innocuous payments and then ballooned into sums that matched renovation costs for a house I had never authorized. She explained forensic accounting to me in plain language. Forensic accounting is the practice of using accounting skills to investigate fraud or embezzlement. It involves reconciling ledger entries, following the path of funds, and looking for anomalies that cannot be explained by ordinary business activity. She described how structured payments are often used to avoid triggering reporting thresholds, and how duplicate invoices can mask personal expenses as business costs. Her explanation lasted less than 3 minutes, yet it opened a world where numbers became evidence and where evidence could become law. In a paragraph like this, I am telling you that the investigation was meticulous and that procedure mattered. Jack called the first hearing a nightmare for a family. He accused us of making a spectacle and asked the judge to stay proceedings. In court, he had that ease again, that way of looking like a man who had been taught to perform sincerity. The judge, Judge Patel, listened with a patient expression and ordered a temporary freeze on accounts while the investigation continued. For the first time, we had legal breathing space. The freeze meant the house could not be sold and the bank could not move funds. For the prosecution, this is called a preliminary injunction, and it is a tool that keeps assets intact while claims are resolved. The injunction bought us time. We used it to gather witnesses, people who had seen Jack at the safe, the neighbor Daniel who remembered him bringing large boxes, the nurse Marta who had worked with my husband and who later told the investigator that Jack had seemed overly interested in financial paperwork. Each witness added a thread to the net. There were moments when the past pressed against the present. I remembered a photograph of Lily as a child, hands flour-covered by her grandmother's apron, and I thought about love as a messy, human thing that can twist under the stress of money. I also remembered the bargains my husband and I had made in private, small promises to care for each other even when our bodies softened. I had kept a ledger in the living room drawer that tracked bills and birthdays. Those pages became a map that Robert used to show that my signature style was consistent over decades, and the differences on the contested trust stood out like a miscolored thread. At our kitchen confrontation scene, I want you to hear how the dialogue unfolded. I will show you the full exchange because details matter and because long dialogues are the way true motives leak out. Sit with me in that kitchen again and smell the lemon and hear the sigh of the refrigerator. Tell me, I said when Lily closed the folder, why would you do this? We are helping you, Jack said. You do not understand, Lily said. Show me, I said. Jack shifted his weight. This is for your safety, he said. Your signature, I said. The paper is not mine, I said. It looks like mine, Lily said. We thought you would prefer to have someone manage things, Jack said. They thought you would thank them, Lily said. I felt the anger like heat under my skin. How dare you, I said. You are my daughter, I said. I did not know you could be so cold, I said. We love you, Jack said. Not like this, I said. We are trying to protect your legacy, Lily said. You have the right to make your own choices, I said. They had rehearsed pity and used it as a weapon. Counting the exchanges later, I realized there were more than 10, and each was a small incision. The investigation expanded. Detective Garcia collected phone records and messages. He subpoenaed server logs and got CCTV footage from the bank, which showed Jack entering the branch alone at times that corresponded with wire instructions. Hannah produced a chart that mapped transfers to renovation companies that listed Jack as a principal. Robert filed a civil suit for fraud, while Detective Garcia coordinated with the district attorney for a criminal probe. There were motions and affidavits and the smell of copier toner in a building that held many secrets. The forensic process now demanded a particular description. For example, the process of obtaining a handwriting expert's analysis involved submitting known samples of my signature, the contested documents, and having an independent analyst compare line pressure, slant, and letter formation. The expert report concluded that the disputed signature had inconsistencies in stroke direction and pressure that were not consistent with my typical signing method. This is methodical, cold work where differences in a loop or a dot can change a life. There is a side of this story I must tell you because it explains how truth behaves when put under pressure. Lily had been living with Jack's financial plan for years, the slow accrual of expectation and then entitlement. She had dinner parties where she practiced the right tone when neighbors asked about Mom's plans. She had calls with Jack in which they rationalized small takeovers of my autonomy as prudent. Over time, that rationalization calcified into entitlement. She was not entirely a villain. She was a woman who had been pressured and who had been terrified of not being seen as competent. Her backstory explains why she made the choice to sign forms at Jack's urging and why she later came to the point of telling the truth. Lily grew up in a house where praise was conditional on achievement. She believed that achieving stability meant making hard choices for the sake of appearance. When she finally told the truth at a deposition, it felt like a chain breaking. Confessing felt to her like betrayal and salvation at once. Jack's backstory is shorter and harder in certain ways. He had emigrated as a young man with a sharp mind and a hunger for status. He learned to move funds and names with a competency that earned him colleagues and clients. He had once been praised by a supervisor for his attention to detail. That same attention became a tool when he started to view assets as scores to be collected. In private, he was both charismatic and cold. He loved the way power felt, and he loved being admired. He had no history of violence, yet his manipulation was a steady, calculated force. He told himself he was providing for his family, and for a time that lie was sufficient. But the truth that Lily eventually told in a taped interview with the district attorney was precise and devastating. She said, "I signed because I was afraid of losing him," and the words landed like a hammer blow to Jack, because what she revealed was intention and complicity rather than accidental oversight. The building tension reached a point where procedural and emotional stakes met. There were 3 moments I identify as tension maxima, each of them folded with sensory detail and each of them carrying the weight of consequence. The first was the moment of the freezing order. The courtroom smelled like old wood and coffee. The judge's gavel had the low thud of inevitability. The audience sat quiet, and the clerk's pages fluttered like small wings. When the injunction was granted, I felt the taste of copper in my mouth and the sudden lightness of the house being secured. The second moment was the deposition, where Lily testified and the room hummed with the static of microphones. Her voice wavered and then steadied. The air conditioning clicked like a metronome. She described meetings and transfers, and the sound of her confession began to rewrite the story. The third was the arrest. It happened at dawn when the sky was a thin gray and the sheriff's lights cut through mist. Jack stood on his porch and the smell of wet grass filled my nose as the officers read him his rights. He put his hands behind his back slowly, like a man taken out of a photograph, and for a moment my heart felt like a locked door. There are technical procedures that were crucial. When Detective Garcia coordinated the search warrant execution, he explained it plainly. A search warrant allows law enforcement to take possession of documents and devices after a judge finds probable cause. The warrant must be specific in what is seized and must be served in a way that preserves the chain of custody. Every device and paper collected was logged, photographed, and stored in evidence bags to maintain integrity. The criminal indictment that followed charged Jack with multiple counts of financial exploitation of an elder and forgery. The legal filings were dry and precise, but they carried the force of consequence. Facing Jack at arraignment was surreal because his charm had hardened into a sort of stunned disbelief. In the courtroom, he looked small under fluorescent lights. The prosecutor, whose name was Reynolds and who had a voice like a bell, laid out the case with a calm that made every number and date feel like a stanza in a poem of exposure. Evidence was read. Hannah explained the tracing of funds with illustrations and charts. The judge asked if Jack had anything to say, and his reply was a string of denials and a claim that he had been trying to protect the family from instability. The truth, however, had shape and velocity now. Witnesses were called, and their testimonies knitted together the pattern of how the trust had been altered and how funds had been diverted to companies that suggested renovation, but which in truth were conduits. There was a moment when my granddaughter, Nora, hugged me in the hallway and said, "Grandma, you are brave." She was 10, and her arms smelled of soap and crayons. It was important to keep these small human gestures in the record, because the story was not only about money, it was about the reclaiming of dignity. The trial was long. There were days when I sat in a metal chair and felt the wooden bench vibrate with the murmur of other cases. There were days when I thought about the motel bed and the way the light had fallen through blinds in a pattern like bars. When the verdict came, it felt like a public accounting of wrong and right. The jury found Jack guilty on most counts and acquitted on a few. The sentence handed down was not vindictive. It was legal consequence. He was ordered to repay certain sums, serve time, and undergo restitution planning. The civil court also returned a ruling that the contested trust was void because of undue influence and forgery. I walked out of the courthouse with a warm scarf around my neck and the taste of victory tempered by everything I had lost. Jack's fall from the pedestal of affection he had built was complete. The man who had called me mother in public was now a man whose credibility had been dismantled. He had been careful to make himself appear necessary and loving, and he was destroyed by the truth Lily had finally told. After the conviction, there were practicalities to manage. The bank released certain funds to cover my living expenses, and Robert negotiated a settlement that included funds for a small trust to protect my needs and to support a program for elder financial protection. We started a modest foundation that partners with local community centers to provide financial literacy sessions for older adults and to train families on recognizing coercive tactics. The project began with a small cohort of volunteers and a grant that allowed us to host monthly seminars. I visited once a month to tell my story in rooms that smelled like coffee and new carpet, there was also healing to do. Lily and I had many conversations, some of them raw, and we worked with a mediator named Claudia who helped us untangle hurt from intent. We are rebuilding a relationship that was tested by greed and fear. 1 month after the verdict, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea and looked around at the boxes that had been left respectfully by neighbors. The house smelled of lemon again, and the sunlight hit the oak table in its old angle. I had settled back in with a sense that the place belonged to me by right and by law. I began to lead weekly meetings at the community center for elders about recognizing undue influence. We had 30 people at the first meeting and donations of pamphlets and pastries. I felt both bruised and enormous. There were days I woke with a memory of the motel and the cold of the TV, and I would write a note reminding myself that I had survived that winter. To anyone seeing the timeline from the outside, this looked like a clean arc. Crime, then justice, then slightly calmer days. But the truth is that rebuilding trust is slow and deliberate. 1 month later, I had clarity and small routines that helped me sleep. 3 months after the case, the foundation had its first recorded success story. A woman in her 70s who attended one of our workshops called and said that her nephew had been pressuring her to sign over a power of attorney. She asked me what to do, and I walked her through steps she could take to protect herself. Find an independent lawyer, keep records, never sign a document under pressure, and ask for time to consider. The woman later reported back that she had declined and kept control of her accounts. That kind of practical, concrete change made me feel like a seed I had planted could actually grow. The foundation also began outreach to banks, prompting several institutions to institute training for tellers to spot potentially coercive transactions. 6 months after the verdict, I had more to report. The foundation had expanded its workshop series, and we had launched a small hotline staffed by volunteers trained to provide resources and to refer callers to legal aid. Lily and I had resumed holiday dinners, but with new boundaries and a new language of honesty. The program we set up had helped 5 families avoid serious financial loss and had inspired a local television segment about elder exploitation. I had written an op-ed in the city paper about the need for clearer protections, and the editorial team asked us to present our data, which showed a reduction in suspicious transfers in our community banking partners. The savings returned to the community in the form of grants to housing repair and food assistance. I felt the heavy work of grief transform into a purposeful legacy. Could finally say that the fight was not only my revenge, but my responsibility to others. I want to end with a reflection that is also an invitation. The most devastating thing about betrayal is not the money lost. It is the subtle recalibration of what you thought love meant. I lost ease. I gained a strange, fierce clarity. The best revenge was not the prison sentence or even the restitution. It was being able to stand in my kitchen and not flinch at the sound of a key in the lock. It was founding a small program that kept others from the path I walked. It was having my granddaughter Nora call me brave and mean it. If you recognize any piece of this story in your life, please do something small today. Write down your finances, make copies of important documents, and share this video with someone who might need it. If you are watching and want to support the foundation we started, look in the description for resources and links to legal aid. Subscribe to this channel for more stories like this and for practical guides to protect elders in your life. The best revenge is not to break someone, but to build yourself and others stronger.